Before the gods walked among mortals, and before heroes carved their names into legend, there existed stories so profound they would echo through eternity, shaping how we understand love, beauty, and the dangerous allure of our own reflection. Tonight, as you drift into peaceful slumber, let me guide you through one of the most haunting and beautiful tales from ancient Greece. The story of Narcissus, a young man whose extraordinary beauty would become both his greatest gift and his ultimate curse. This is not merely a tale of vanity or self-obsession, though those elements weave through its narrative like golden threads through dark fabric. Instead, this is a story about the fundamental human struggle between self-love and the love of others, about the thin line that separates confidence from arrogance, and about how the very qualities that make us most admired can transform into the instruments of our destruction. As you settle into comfort and allow your mind to wander through these ancient landscapes, you will discover that Narcissus represents something far more complex and tragic than simple conceit. The tale begins in the verdant hills of Boeotia, where the crystal waters of the river Cephissus wound their way through meadows so lush and beautiful that the gods themselves would pause in their celestial duties to admire the earthly paradise below. It was here, in this realm where nature displayed her finest artistry, that the river god Cephissus first encountered the nymph Liriope, whose beauty was so striking that even the flowing waters seemed to still in her presence. Liriope possessed the ethereal grace that characterized the water nymphs, with skin that seemed to glow with the soft luminescence of moonlight on water, and hair that flowed like liquid silver down her graceful form. Her voice carried the melodic quality of streams babbling over smooth stones, and her movements held the fluid elegance of water itself. When she walked through the forests, flowers would turn their faces toward her as if drawn by an invisible force, and even the most timid woodland creatures would approach without fear, sensing the gentle nature that radiated from her divine essence. The river god Cephissus, whose domain encompassed the life-giving waters that nourished the fertile valleys of central Greece, found himself utterly captivated by this extraordinary nymph. Unlike many of his divine brethren who pursued their desires through force or trickery, Cephissus approached Liriope with the patient persistence of water itself, wearing away resistance through gentle but constant attention. He would cause his waters to sparkle more brilliantly when she walked along his banks, would guide the most beautiful flowers to bloom in her path, and would ensure that the most melodious birds gathered to sing whenever she appeared near his domain. For months, this courtship continued, with the river god demonstrating his devotion through countless small acts of natural beauty and wonder. He would create perfect reflective pools where Liriope could admire her own loveliness, would cause schools of silver fish to dance in intricate patterns beneath the surface, and would ensure that his waters remained perfectly clear and sweet whenever she chose to drink from them. The nymph, initially cautious, as her kind often were when approached by the more powerful gods, gradually found herself charmed by Cephissus's gentle persistence and the obvious sincerity of his affection. Their union, when it finally occurred, was blessed by the natural world itself. The trees seemed to lean inward to create a natural cathedral, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy of living green. Flowers bloomed in unprecedented profusion, their petals creating a carpet of every imaginable color and fragrance. The very air seemed to shimmer with divine energy as the river god and the water nymph joined together in a love that embodied the perfect harmony between flowing water and the graceful spirits who dwelt within its depths. From this blessed union came a child whose beauty would surpass even that of his divinely lovely parents. When Narcissus entered the world, the attending nymphs gasped in wonder at the infant's extraordinary appearance. Even as a newborn, his features displayed a symmetry and perfection that seemed almost impossibly refined. His skin held the luminous quality of his mother's divine nature, combined with the clear, reflective depth of his father's watery realm. His hair, even in infancy, showed hints of the golden brown hue that would later catch sunlight like precious metal, and his eyes held depths that seemed to contain all the mystery and beauty of hidden forest pools. As word of the child's remarkable beauty spread through the divine community, it eventually reached the ears of Tiresias, the blind prophet whose gift of foresight had made him both revered and feared throughout the ancient world. Tiresias possessed the unique ability to perceive truths that remained hidden from others, to see the threads of fate that connected present actions to future consequences. His blindness to the physical world had been compensated by an inner vision that penetrated the very fabric of destiny itself. Liriopa, like many new mothers blessed with an extraordinary child, felt both pride and anxiety about her son's future. The beauty that made Narcissus so remarkable also made him vulnerable to the jealousy of gods and the dangerous attention of those who might seek to possess or destroy what they could not have. Seeking reassurance and guidance about her beloved child's destiny, she made the journey to the sacred grove where Tiresias delivered his prophecies, carrying the infant Narcissus in her arms. The meeting between the prophet and the child would prove to be one of the most significant moments in the unfolding tragedy. As Liriope approached the ancient seer, she noticed how the very air seemed to grow heavy with prophetic power. The birds fell silent in the trees, and even the wind stilled as if nature itself held its breath in anticipation of the revelation to come. Tiresias, despite his blindness, seemed to sense the presence of the extraordinary child before Liriope even spoke. When she finally found the courage to voice her question, asking whether her beautiful son would live a long and happy life, the prophet's response came not as the reassuring blessing she had hoped for, but as a cryptic warning that would haunt her for years to come. His words, delivered in the rhythmic cadence that characterized prophetic utterances, carried the weight of inevitable fate. He will live long as if he never knows himself. The paradox embedded within this prophecy was both profound and troubling. How could ignorance of oneself be the key to longevity and happiness? What terrible knowledge could self-awareness bring that would prove fatal to one so young and beautiful? Liriope left the prophet's grove with more questions than answers, cradling her infant son and wondering what cruel twist of fate could make self-knowledge itself a deadly poison. As Narcissus grew from infant to child and then to adolescent, the prophet's words seemed increasingly irrelevant to daily life. The boy developed into a young man of such extraordinary beauty that his mere presence would cause conversations to halt and crowds to gather. His features matured with perfect symmetry, each element complementing the others in harmonious proportion. His golden brown hair caught sunlight and seemed to glow with its own inner radiance, while his eyes held depths that changed color, like forest pools reflecting different aspects of sky and foliage. But it was not merely physical beauty that distinguished Narcissus from other young men of his generation. He possessed a natural grace of movement that made every gesture appear deliberately choreographed, a voice that carried musical undertones capable of charming both mortals and immortals, and an unconscious magnetism that drew others to him like moths to flame. When he walked through the marketplace, merchants would offer him their finest goods for free, hoping merely to bask in his presence for a few moments longer. When he participated in athletic competitions, spectators would forget to cheer for their own champions, mesmerized by the fluid perfection of his movements. Yet for all the adoration that surrounded him, Narcissus remained strangely untouched by romantic love. Countless admirers sought his attention, both mortal and divine, but none succeeded in awakening any answering passion in his heart. Beautiful maidens would compose poetry celebrating his magnificence, only to have their verses returned unread. Wealthy suitors would offer extravagant gifts and promises of devotion, only to find their offerings politely but firmly refused. Even nymphs and minor goddesses, accustomed to having their desires fulfilled through divine privilege, found themselves dismissed with courteous indifference. This pattern of rejection was not born from cruelty or conscious arrogance, but rather from a peculiar emotional detachment that seemed to insulate Narcissus from the very feelings that his beauty inspired in others. He observed the passionate declarations and desperate pleas of his admirers with the same mild interest he might show toward an entertaining theatrical performance. Understanding intellectually that these emotions were significant to those experiencing them, but remaining fundamentally unable to reciprocate or even fully comprehend their intensity. His parents, initially proud of their son's discriminating nature and his resistance to inappropriate attachments, gradually began to worry about this emotional isolation. Liriope, remembering Tiresias's cryptic warning about self-knowledge, wondered whether her son's inability to love others might be connected to his equally profound inability to truly understand himself. She watched as he moved through life like a beautiful statue given the gift of animation but denied the capacity for deep emotional connection. The young man's daily routine reflected this emotional detachment. He would rise each morning and spend considerable time grooming himself, not from vanity, but with the methodical precision of someone maintaining a valuable instrument. He would select his clothing with careful attention to how different fabrics and colors complemented his natural coloring, arrange his hair to catch the light most favorably, and ensure that every aspect of his appearance met the impossibly high standards that his beauty seemed to demand. After completing these preparations, Narcissus would venture out into the world, moving through his days with the unconscious confidence of someone who had never encountered rejection or disappointment. He would participate in whatever activities his social position required, whether athletic competitions, religious festivals, or social gatherings, performing his role with perfect competence while remaining emotionally distant from the proceedings. This emotional distance extended even to his relationships with friends and family members. While he treated everyone with unfailing courtesy and consideration, those closest to him gradually came to understand that they were interacting with only the surface layer of his personality. Deeper currents of thought and feeling, if they existed at all, remained hidden beneath the flawless exterior that he presented to the world. As Narcissus approached his 16th birthday, the anniversary that would mark his transition from adolescence to full adulthood, the divine world began to take notice of this beautiful young man who seemed immune to the very emotions that governed most mortal and immortal existence. His reputation had spread far beyond the boundaries of Boeotia, carried by traveling merchants, visiting dignitaries, and the countless individuals whose lives had been touched, however briefly, by encounters with his extraordinary presence. Among those who heard these tales was Echo, a mountain nymph whose own story was already marked by divine punishment and tragic limitation, though she did not yet know how profoundly her fate would become intertwined with that of the beautiful young man whose very name was beginning to be whispered in the most distant corners of the ancient world. Distant worlds, as corners of the ancient, whispered in the most discerned. Echo's story had begun years before she would ever encounter Narcissus in the golden halls of Mount Olympus, where the gods conducted their eternal dramas of power, passion, and revenge. She had been among the most favored of Hera's attendants, blessed with a voice of such melodious beauty that even the queen of the gods would pause in her divine duties to listen when Echo spoke. The nymph possessed not only vocal beauty, but also a gift for storytelling that could weave the most mundane events into captivating narratives, holding audiences spellbound with her eloquent descriptions and perfectly timed revelations. This talent for captivating speech, which should have been Echo's greatest blessing, became the instrument of her downfall through the complex web of divine politics that governed Olympian society. Zeus, ever prone to romantic adventures despite his marriage to Hera, had been conducting a series of clandestine affairs with various mountain nymphs, and he found in Echo the perfect accomplice for concealing these indiscretions from his eternally vigilant wife. The arrangement seemed simple enough at first. Whenever Hera grew suspicious and set out to investigate reports of her husband's infidelity, Echo would intercept the Queen of the Gods and engage her in lengthy, elaborate conversations that provided Zeus with the time necessary to conclude his romantic encounters and return to Olympus with an appearance of innocence. Echo's natural storytelling abilities made these diversions seem completely spontaneous and genuine, as she would regale Hera with fascinating tales of mortal adventures, divine interventions, and cosmic phenomena that required a detailed explanation and discussion. For months, this deception proved successful. Echo's stories grew increasingly elaborate and entertaining as she developed a repertoire of narratives specifically designed to hold Hera's attention for extended periods. She would describe in vivid detail the changing seasons in distant lands, the heroic exploits of mortal champions, the intricate politics of various city-states, and the fascinating customs of foreign peoples. Her voice would rise and fall with dramatic emphasis. Her gestures would paint pictures in the air, and her timing would build suspense and release it with the skill of a master performer. But divine intelligence is not easily fooled indefinitely, and Hera's suspicions eventually focused not on Zeus's activities, but on Echo's convenient appearances whenever investigation seemed imminent. The Queen of the Gods began to notice the pattern of elaborate conversations that always seemed to occur precisely when Zeus was absent from Olympus, and her growing awareness of the deception filled her with a rage that shook the very foundations of the celestial realm. When Hera finally confronted Echo with evidence of her complicity in Zeus's deceptions, the nymph's attempts at explanation only served to further inflame the goddess's anger. Echo's gift for elaborate storytelling, which had served her so well in concealing Zeus's affairs, now worked against her as Hera interpreted every word as additional evidence of the nymph's talent for deception and manipulation. The punishment that Hera devised was both cruel and ironically appropriate, targeting the very ability that had made Echo valuable to Zeus in the first place. The goddess decreed that Echo would retain her beautiful voice, but would lose forever the ability to initiate speech or express her own thoughts and feelings. From that moment forward, the nymph would be capable only of repeating the final words spoken by others, and transforming her from a master storyteller into a mere reflection of other voices. The curse took effect immediately, and Echo discovered with horror that her tongue would no longer obey her will. When she tried to protest the unfairness of her punishment, she found herself capable only of repeating Hera's own words back to the goddess. When she attempted to plead for mercy, she could only echo the harsh syllables of divine judgment. Her voice, once the instrument of her greatest joy and accomplishment, had become a prison that trapped her thoughts and emotions behind barriers of enforced silence. Banished from Olympus in disgrace, Echo retreated to the mountain caves and forest glades where she had been born, seeking solace in the familiar landscapes of her origin. The other nymphs, initially sympathetic to her plight, gradually grew frustrated with her inability to participate in normal conversation. Social gatherings became exercises in awkwardness, as Echo could contribute nothing to discussions except the repetition of others' final phrases, creating strange and often nonsensical exchanges that disrupted the natural flow of communication. The isolation that resulted from her curse was profound and devastating. Echo found herself excluded from the rich social life that had previously sustained her, unable to share her thoughts, express her feelings, or contribute meaningfully to the community of spirits that inhabited the natural world. She would sit alone in hidden grottos, listening to the conversations of other nymphs and forest creatures, desperate to participate, but capable only of creating hollow echoes of their words. As months passed into years, Echo's personality began to change under the weight of her enforced silence. The vivacious, outgoing nymph who had once delighted in social interaction became increasingly withdrawn and melancholy. She would spend long hours in solitary contemplation, her thoughts turning inward as she struggled to maintain her sense of identity without to express it through speech. The mountains themselves seemed to respond to her sorrow, creating new acoustic phenomena as her unexpressed emotions found outlet through the landscape's natural resonance. It was during this period of isolation and emotional transformation that reports first reached Echo's mountain domain of a young man in the valleys below, whose beauty was said to surpass that of the gods themselves. The descriptions that filtered up through the network of woodland spirits spoke of features so perfectly proportioned that mortal artists despaired of capturing their essence, of a voice that carried musical undertones capable of charming birds from trees, and of a presence so magnetic that entire crowds would gather simply to observe him passing through their midst. These tales of Narcissus's extraordinary beauty awakened something within Echo's damaged heart that she had thought destroyed forever by Hera's curse. For the first time since her punishment, she felt the stirring of emotions that transcended her own suffering and isolation. The descriptions of the young man's perfection created images in her mind that seemed to glow with their own internal light, and she found herself dreaming of encounters that might restore meaning to her silent existence. The irony of her situation was not lost on Echo even in her emotional state. She who had once been renowned for her ability to captivate others through eloquent speech was now drawn to someone who, by all accounts, remained unmoved by the passionate declarations of countless admirers. The very curse that had stripped her of the ability to woo through words might prove irrelevant when dealing with someone who seemed immune to all forms of romantic persuasion. Yet something deeper than mere physical attraction was drawing Echo toward the legendary beauty of Narcissus. Perhaps it was recognition of a kindred isolation, for the reports suggested that his extraordinary appearance had created a barrier between him and normal human connection, every bit as effective as her enforced silence. Perhaps it was the hope that someone who existed outside the normal patterns of social interaction might be capable of understanding and accepting her own damaged condition. As spring approached and the mountain snows began to melt, creating rushing streams that carried news from the valleys below, Echo made a decision that would prove as fateful as it was inevitable. She would descend from her mountainous refuge and seek out this paragon of beauty whose very existence had rekindled emotions she had thought forever extinguished. The prospect filled her with both anticipation and terror, for she understood that her curse would make any attempt at communication fraught with potential misunderstanding and humiliation. The journey down from her mountain sanctuary took Echo through landscapes that seemed to mirror her internal transformation. The harsh, rocky terrain of the high peaks gave way gradually to gentler slopes dotted with early spring flowers, then to the lush meadows and fertile valleys where mortal communities flourished under the blessing of more temperate conditions. With each step away from her place of exile and toward the realm where Narcissus lived, Echo felt her dormant hopes awakening alongside the natural world's emergence from winter's grip. As she traveled, Echo practiced the limited forms of communication available to her under Hera's curse. She experimented with timing her repetitions to create different meanings, learned to use gesture and expression to supplement her echoed words, and developed strategies for positioning herself in conversations so that others' statements might provide her with appropriate responses to repeat. These preparations felt both pathetic and necessary, representing her desperate attempt to function as a social being despite the divine punishment that had transformed her into a mere acoustic phenomenon. The stories of Narcissus's daily habits had reached even the remote mountain regions, carried by the constant network of gossip that connected every corner of the ancient world. Echo learned that he frequented certain groves and meadows, that he preferred the early morning hours for solitary walks, and that he often paused beside streams and pools to observe the play of light on water. This last detail seemed particularly significant to the cursed nymph, who began to envision scenarios where her first encounter with the beautiful young man might unfold beside some mirror-like surface that would reflect both his perfection and her own longing. The morning when Echo finally encountered Narcissus arrived with an ethereal quality that seemed designed by the fates themselves to set the stage for tragedy. Mist clung to the forest floor like silver silk, diffusing the early sunlight into soft beams that created an almost dreamlike atmosphere throughout the woodland. The air carried the sweet fragrance of blooming jasmine and wild roses, while birdsong provided a gentle symphony that seemed to celebrate the promise of new beginnings, though it would soon bear witness to heartbreak of mythic proportions. Echo had positioned herself in a grove that bordered one of Narcissus's favorite walking paths, concealed behind a cluster of ancient oak trees whose massive trunks provided perfect cover for observation. Her heart beat with anticipation, so intense that she feared its rhythm might disturb the morning stillness and alert her quarry to her presence before she was ready to reveal herself. Every sound seemed amplified in her heightened state of awareness, from the whisper of leaves stirring in the gentle breeze to the distant murmur of a stream flowing over smooth stones. When Narcissus finally appeared on the forest path, the reality of his presence exceeded even the most elaborate descriptions that had reached Echo's mountain refuge. The morning light seemed to gather around him as he walked, creating an almost supernatural luminescence that enhanced every perfect feature. His movements displayed the unconscious grace of someone who had never known physical awkwardness, each step flowing seamlessly into the next with the fluid elegance of a dancer who performed for an audience of trees and flowers. The young man's clothing, while simple in design, had been chosen with the careful attention to detail that characterized all aspects of his appearance. The soft white tunic he wore complemented his golden skin tone perfectly, while the light brown cloak draped over his shoulders brought out the warm highlights in his hair. Even his footwear seemed selected to enhance rather than merely protect, crafted from leather, dyed to match the earth tones that predominated in his natural coloring. But it was Narcissus's face that truly captured Echo's complete attention and confirmed her growing realization that no description, however eloquent, could have prepared her for this moment of direct encounter. His features possessed a symmetry that seemed almost mathematically perfect, as if some divine geometer had calculated the precise proportions that would create the most pleasing visual harmony. His eyes, shifting between green and gold, depending on how the light struck them, held depths that suggested hidden complexities beneath the flawless surface, though those depths remained tantalizingly inaccessible to casual observation. As Echo watched from her concealment, Narcissus paused in his morning walk to examine a particularly striking flower that had bloomed beside the path. The attention he paid to this simple natural specimen revealed something about his character that the distant reports had not captured. His appreciation for beauty extended beyond mere vanity about his own appearance to encompass a genuine aesthetic sensitivity that found pleasure in the perfection of created things, whether divine, natural, or human in origin. The way his fingers traced the delicate petals with reverent gentleness, the manner in which his expression softened as he inhaled the flower's fragrance, and the several moments he spent in quiet contemplation of this small miracle of natural artistry suggested depths of feeling that contradicted the reports of his emotional coldness. Perhaps, Echo dared to hope, His apparent immunity to romantic attachment stemmed not from fundamental inability to feel, but from standards so elevated that no previous admirer had managed to awaken his carefully guarded heart. Gathering her courage, Echo stepped from behind the oak trees and began to follow Narcissus at a discreet distance, her bare feet making no sound on the moss-covered forest floor. Her plan, such as it was, involved shadowing him until an opportunity arose for natural interaction, perhaps when he paused to rest or drink from one of the streams that crisscrossed this particular section of woodland. She understood that her curse would make any conversation challenging, but she hoped that her physical presence and obvious admiration might communicate what her limited speech could not adequately express. The forest path wound deeper into increasingly secluded territory, leading away from areas where other mortals might interrupt what Echo desperately hoped would become an intimate encounter. Ancient trees formed a natural cathedral overhead, their interlaced branches creating patterns of light and shadow that shifted constantly as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky. The very landscape seemed to conspire in creating the perfect setting for romantic awakening, with secluded glades appearing at regular intervals like stages prepared for the unfolding of passionate drama. Narcissus moved through this enchanted environment with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in natural settings, occasionally pausing to observe interesting rock formations or to listen to the varied songs of birds that inhabited different elevations of the forest canopy. His solitary nature was evident in these moments of quiet appreciation, as he seemed to find in the natural world a companionship that human society had apparently failed to provide. This preference for solitude over social interaction struck Echo as both promising and ominous, suggesting that he might be receptive to genuine connection, while simultaneously indicating that achieving such connection would require extraordinary circumstances. As the morning progressed and Echo continued her careful pursuit, she began to notice subtle changes in Narcissus's behavior that suggested he was becoming aware of her presence without being able to identify its source. He would pause occasionally and glance around with the alertness of someone sensing observation, his head tilted slightly as if listening for sounds that might reveal a hidden watcher. These moments of heightened awareness caused Echo's heart to race with a mixture of excitement and terror, as discovery might lead either to the romantic encounter she desperately desired or to the humiliating rejection that had been the fate of so many previous admirers. The crucial moment arrived when Narcissus reached a clearing centered around a natural spring that bubbled up from underground sources to create a perfectly circular pool of the clearest water Echo had ever seen. The spring's surface acted as a flawless mirror, reflecting not only the surrounding trees and sky, but also every detail of whatever appeared above it with startling clarity and precision. Narcissus approached this natural wonder with an obvious pleasure, settling himself on a moss-covered boulder that provided an ideal vantage point for observing the interplay of light and water that created constantly shifting patterns of reflected beauty. This was the opportunity Echo had been waiting for, and she moved closer to the clearing's edge while remaining concealed within the forest's shadows. From this position, she could observe every nuance of Narcissus's expression as he gazed into the spring's reflective surface, and what she saw there filled her with a complex mixture of hope and foreboding that she could not immediately understand. The young man's face, reflected in the spring's mirror-like surface, seemed to capture his attention in a way that nothing else had during their morning journey through the forest. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes focusing with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something of profound significance in the watery mirror before him. His expression shifted from casual interest to fascination to something approaching wonder as he studied the reflected image with growing absorption. Echo watched this transformation with growing concern and sensing that something significant was occurring but unable to comprehend its full implications. The prophecy of Tiresias, unknown to her but crucial to understanding the unfolding tragedy, was beginning to manifest as Narcissus encountered for the first time a clear reflection of his own extraordinary beauty. The spring's perfect surface provided what no polished metal mirror or still pond had previously offered, a flawless image that revealed every detail of his appearance with startling clarity and precision. The moment of recognition, when it came, was subtle but unmistakable. Narcissus's eyes widened slightly as understanding dawned, and his breathing became more shallow as the full impact of his reflected beauty struck him with unprecedented force. For 16 years, he had moved through the world, aware of others' reactions to his appearance, but never fully comprehending the source of their fascination. Now, seeing himself as others saw him, he began to understand why countless admirers had pursued him with such desperate intensity. But understanding his effect on others was only the beginning of a much more complex and dangerous process. As Narcissus continued to gaze into the spring's reflective surface, his initial wonder gradually transformed into something deeper and more troubling. The image in the water seemed to possess a life and allure independent of its source, becoming not merely a reflection, but an object of fascination in its own right. Echo, still concealed at the clearing's edge, watched with growing alarm as Narcissus's casual interest in his reflection deepened into something approaching obsession. He leaned closer to the water's surface, his eyes never leaving the reflected face that gazed back at him with equal intensity. His hands reached toward the image as if to touch it, only to withdraw when the resulting ripples distorted the perfect clarities of the reflection and caused the beautiful face to fragment into meaningless patterns of light and shadow. The spring's surface quickly stilled, restoring the perfect mirror that had first captured Narcissus's attention, and the reflected image returned with all its original beauty and compelling power. This cycle of reaching toward the reflection, accidentally disturbing it, waiting for the surface to calm, and then being recaptured by the restored image, began to repeat with increasing frequency as Narcissus found himself unable to look away from the face in the water. Echo realized with growing horror that she was witnessing the beginning of something far more serious than simple vanity or momentary fascination. The intensity of Narcissus's focus on his reflection, the way his breathing had become shallow and rapid, and the manner in which his entire body seemed to strain toward the water's surface suggested the onset of a passion as powerful and consuming as any she had ever observed. But this passion was directed toward an image that existed only as reflected light, a beautiful phantom that could never return the love it inspired. The irony of the situation struck Echo with cruel clarity. She who could only repeat the words of others was witnessing someone falling in love with nothing more than his own reflection, a visual echo that possessed even less substance than her vocal repetitions. Both of them were trapped by divine punishment into relationships with mere shadows of reality, though Narcissus did not yet understand the true nature of his predicament. As the morning wore on and the sun climbed higher overhead, Narcissus remained transfixed by his reflection, unaware of Echo's presence or indeed of anything beyond the beautiful face that gazed back at him from the spring's surface. His initial wonder had evolved into something approaching worship as he studied every detail of the reflected features with the devotion of an artist memorizing a masterpiece or a lover cataloging the perfections of a beloved. The reflected face seemed to respond to his attention, its expressions shifting subtly as clouds moved across the sky and changed the quality of light falling on the water's surface. These minor variations in illumination created the illusion that the image possessed independent life and consciousness, that it was choosing to reveal different aspects of its beauty in response to his adoring gaze. What Narcissus was actually seeing was the play of natural light, creating different shadows and highlights on his own features, but in his increasingly obsessed state, these changes seemed like deliberate communications from the mysterious beauty in the spring. Echo understood that she was witnessing the fulfillment of Tiresias's prophecy, though she had never heard the prophet's words. The self-knowledge that the blind seer had warned would prove fatal was manifesting not as psychological insight, but as literal self-perception, as Narcissus encountered his own image and fell victim to the very beauty that had made him the object of countless others' desires. The curse that would destroy him was not imposed by any angry deity, but emerged naturally from his own extraordinary perfection, meeting its perfect reflection in circumstances that made recognition inevitable. The realization of what was happening filled Echo with a desperation that transcended her own romantic desires and transformed into something approaching divine terror. She understood instinctively that she was witnessing the beginning of a tragedy that would surpass in its scope and horror anything the ancient world had yet produced. The beautiful young man who had awakened her dormant heart was falling victim to a curse more subtle and devastating than any spell cast by jealous gods or vengeful spirits. Yet even as this understanding crystallized in her mind, Echo found herself paralyzed by the very limitations that Hera's punishment had imposed upon her. How could she warn Narcissus of his danger when she possessed no voice of her own? How could she break the spell of the reflection when any sound she made would merely echo his own words back to him? The cruel irony of her situation seemed designed by the fates themselves to ensure maximum suffering for all involved. As the sun reached its zenith and began its slow descent toward the western horizon, Narcissus remained motionless beside the spring, his entire being focused on the image that held him captive. Hours passed like moments in his altered state of consciousness, time itself seeming to slow and stretch as he lost himself in contemplation of the reflected beauty. His body remained rigid in its position of adoration, muscles straining with the effort of maintaining perfect stillness, lest any movement disturb the precious image. The physical toll of this unnatural posture gradually began to manifest in subtle ways that Narcissus himself seemed unaware of. but that Echo observed with growing concern. His breathing became increasingly shallow as his chest rose and fell with mechanical precision, each breath carefully controlled to minimize any disturbance to the water's surface. His eyes, fixed unblinkingly on the reflection, began to show signs of strain as tears formed along their edges, though whether from the effort of staring or from some deeper emotional response remained unclear. Most troubling of all was the expression that had settled over Narcissus's features, as his fascination deepened into something approaching religious devotion. His face had taken on the ethereal quality of a mystic experiencing divine revelation, with a luminous intensity that seemed to radiate from within. The beauty that had always distinguished him from other mortals now appeared almost supernatural, as if his obsession with his own reflection was somehow concentrating and purifying his physical perfection into something that transcended normal human appearance. Echo watched these transformations with a mixture of awe and horror, recognizing that she was witnessing something unprecedented in the annals of divine punishment. Unlike the straightforward curses that typically befell mortals who offended the gods, this tragedy was unfolding according to its own internal logic, driven not by external forces, but by the interaction between Narcissus's extraordinary beauty and his own capacity for love. The spring had become merely the catalyst for a process that had been waiting within him all along, dormant until the proper conditions allowed it to emerge. The afternoon shadows began to lengthen as the sun continued its westward journey, creating subtle changes in the light that fell upon the spring's surface. These variations in illumination caused corresponding shifts in the reflected image, as different angles of sunlight revealed new aspects of Narcissus's beauty or cast familiar features in novel arrangements of highlight and shadow. Each change seemed to deepen his fascination, as if he were discovering an infinite series of beloved faces within the single reflection, each more captivating than the last. During one of these luminous transformations, when a shaft of golden sunlight struck the water at precisely the right angle to make the reflection seem to glow with its own inner fire, Narcissus finally spoke for the first time since arriving at the spring. His voice, when it came, carried a quality of breathless wonder that Echo had never heard from any mortal throat, a tone that seemed to bridge the gap between human speech and divine song. "Who are you?" he whispered to the image, his words barely audible above the gentle bubbling of the spring's source. "What god has sent you to torment me with beauty beyond mortal comprehension? Are you some divine being taking pity on my solitude, or are you perhaps a punishment sent by those I have rejected in my ignorance?" Echo's heart leapt at the sound of his voice, not only because it broke the hours of terrible silence, but because his words provided her with the opportunity she had been desperately seeking. The questions he posed to his reflection were exactly the kind of statements she could work with under the constraints of her curse, offering phrases that might be meaningfully repeated to create the illusion of dialogue. Moving closer to the edge of the clearing while still maintaining her concealment, Echo positioned herself so that her voice would seem to emanate from the general directions of the spring without revealing her specific location. When she spoke, repeating the final portion of Narcissus's question, her voice carried across the water with crystalline clarity. "Are you perhaps A punishment sent by those I have rejected? The effect of this unexpected response was immediate and dramatic. Narcissus started violently, his sudden movement sending ripples across the spring's surface that shattered the perfect reflection into fragments of dancing light. For a moment, his obsession was broken as he looked around the clearing with wild eyes, searching for the source of the mysterious voice that had seemed to answer his question with such prophetic accuracy. "Who speaks?" he called out, his voice now carrying an edge of fear that had been absent from his earlier whispered questions. "Show yourself. Are you the guardian of this sacred spring? Have I offended you by gazing too long into these holy waters?" Again Echo seized upon his words, repeating with desperate hope, "Show yourself. Have I offended you?" The repetition of his own phrases in a feminine voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once filled Narcissus with a complex mixture of hope, confusion, and growing excitement. Here, at last, was someone who seemed to understand his situation, who responded to his questions with answers that, while enigmatic, suggested knowledge of his predicament. The mysterious speaker appeared to be as eager for revelation as he was, pleading with the same urgency he felt for someone to show themselves. "Come forward," he called, rising from his position beside the spring for the first time in hours. "Let me see you as clearly as you must see me. I sense that you understand what is happening to me, that you know something of this strange enchantment that has fallen upon me." Echo's response came immediately, charged with all the longing and desperation she had been unable to express. "Let me see you. I sense that you understand." The eagerness in her repetition, the way her voice seemed to caress his words as she spoke them back to him, convinced Narcissus that he had found someone who shared his newfound capacity for passionate feeling. The mysterious speaker seemed as desperate for connection as he had suddenly become, as hungry for love as the image in the spring had made him. Perhaps this was the answer to his dilemma, the living person who could provide the companionship that the reflection promised but could never deliver. "Yes," he cried, moving away from the spring and toward the forest edge where Echo's voice seemed strongest. "Come to me. Let us end this torment of separation and loneliness. I have discovered something today that I never understood before, something about the nature of love and beauty that changes everything." "Come to me," Echo repeated, her voice breaking with emotion as she emerged from her concealment at the clearing's edge. "Let us end this torment." When Narcissus saw her stepping from the shadows of the ancient oaks, his initial reaction was one of profound disappointment that struck him like a physical blow. After hours of gazing upon the supernatural perfection of his own reflection, Echo's merely mortal beauty seemed almost plain by comparison. She was lovely by any normal standard, with the ethereal grace characteristic of her nymph heritage, but she lacked the transcendent perfection that had awakened his capacity for love beside the spring. More troubling still was the realization that Echo was not the mysterious being he had imagined based on her voice. The words that had seemed so wise and understanding when heard in isolation now revealed themselves as mere repetitions of his own statements. The profound dialogue he had thought they were sharing was nothing more than an elaborate echo, an acoustic phenomenon that had tricked him into believing he had found a kindred spirit. "You," he said, his voice flat with disillusionment. "You are just a nymph. You have been repeating my own words back to me. There is no understanding between us, no shared recognition of beauty's power. You are as ordinary as all the others who have pursued me with their shallow desires." Echo's face crumpled with anguish as she heard the dismissal in his tone, but she could only repeat his final words. "You are as ordinary as all the others." The cruelty of hearing her own ordinariness confirmed in her beloved's voice, spoken in the exact tone he had used to reject her, shattered something fundamental within Echo's spirit. She had dared to hope that her curse might prove irrelevant with someone who seemed to exist outside normal social patterns, that her obvious devotion might compensate for her inability to speak her own thoughts. Instead, she had been reduced to nothing more than an acoustic curiosity, dismissed with the same casual indifference that Narcissus had shown to countless other admirers. "Leave me," he continued, already turning back toward the spring with obvious eagerness to resume his interrupted contemplation. "I have found something infinitely more beautiful than anything the mortal world can offer. Your presence here is an unwelcome distraction from matters of far greater importance." "Leave me," Echo whispered, the words falling from her lips like drops of poison. An unwelcome distraction, but she could not leave, despite the pain his rejection caused and despite his clear desire for solitude. Something deeper than romantic attachment kept her rooted to the spot, a recognition that Narcissus was in terrible danger from forces he could not understand or control. The spring that had awakened his capacity for love was also destroying him, creating desires that could never be fulfilled and needs that would consume him from within. Narcissus had already returned to his position beside the water, settling back into the same rigid posture he had maintained for hours. The brief interruption seemed to have intensified rather than diminished his obsession, as if the encounter with mundane reality had only served to highlight the superior allure of the reflected image. He gazed into the spring with renewed hunger, his eyes drinking in every detail of the beautiful face that gazed back with matching intensity. "There you are," he murmured to his reflection, his voice carrying the tender relief of a lover reunited with his beloved after a painful separation. "I thought I had lost you forever." That interruption made me realize how precious you are, how much more beautiful than anything else in this world. Promise me you will never disappear again. The image, of course, could make no such promise, existing only as long as Narcissus remained positioned to cast his reflection upon the water's surface. But in his increasingly delusional state, the simple fact of the reflection's return seemed like a miraculous gift, proof of some deeper connection between himself and the beautiful being who lived beneath the spring's surface. Echo settled herself among the roots of a massive oak tree at the clearing's edge, wrapping her arms around her knees as she prepared for what she somehow knew would be a long and terrible vigil. She could not abandon Narcissus to his fate, despite his rejection of her love, because she understood with prophetic clarity that he was heading toward destruction. Her own suffering seemed insignificant compared to the tragedy she was witnessing, though the pain of unrequited love continued to tear at her heart with every breath. As the sun sank lower in the western sky, painting the forest in shades of gold and crimson that rivaled the beauty of any divine artwork, Narcissus began to speak to his reflection in longer and more elaborate declarations of love. His words revealed the depth of his transformation from the emotionally distant young man who had rejected countless admirers to someone consumed by passion more intense than any mortal had ever experienced. "How is it possible," he asked the image, "that I could have lived 16 years without understanding what love truly means? All those who pursued me with their desperate pleas and elaborate gifts were trying to share with me this very feeling, this complete surrender of self to another's beauty. I rejected them not from cruelty, but from ignorance, not understanding that they were offering me the greatest gift one being can give to another." The confession revealed the tragic irony at the heart of his situation. Only now, when it was too late, did Narcissus comprehend the emotions he had inspired in others and the significance of what he had rejected. His newfound understanding of love's power came coupled with the realization that he had caused immense suffering through his previous indifference, but this knowledge served only to deepen his obsession with the one being who seemed to understand and return his feelings. "But you are different," he continued, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper meant only for the reflection's ears. "You gaze at me with the same intensity I feel. You match my every expression with perfect understanding. You never look away or show the slightest sign of rejection or indifference. In you, I have found not only love, but perfect love, the kind that exists only in the realm of gods and heroes." So Echo listened to these passionate declarations with a heart that seemed to break anew with each word. The love that Narcissus was describing with such eloquent intensity was exactly what she felt for him, the complete surrender of self that transforms the lover's entire existence around the beloved's presence. Yet he was directing these feelings toward an illusion, pouring out his heart to an image that could never respond except by reflecting his own expressions back to him. The physical toll of his vigil was becoming increasingly apparent as the hours passed. Narcissus had not eaten since before dawn, had consumed no water except what he could cup in his hands from the spring itself, and had remained in essentially the same position for the entire day. His body was beginning to show signs of strain and exhaustion, but his obsession seemed to provide him with superhuman endurance, as if love itself were sustaining him beyond normal mortal limitations. As twilight approached and the forest began to fill with the mysterious shadows that marked the transition between day and night, the quality of light falling on the spring's surface changed in ways that made the reflection even more captivating. The golden rays of the setting sun struck the water at angles that seemed to set the reflected image on fire, creating an illusion of divine radiance that convinced Narcissus he was gazing upon a being of supernatural beauty and power. "Are you perhaps a god in disguise?" he asked the reflection, his voice filled with religious awe. "Have you taken this form to test my worthiness or for divine love? I would gladly abandon my mortal existence if it meant I could join you in whatever realm you inhabit, could spend eternity gazing into your perfect features without fear of separation or loss." The desperate longing in his voice moved Echo to tears, though she remained silent in her hiding place among the oak roots. She understood that Narcissus was offering to sacrifice everything for love, displaying the kind of selfless devotion that she herself felt but could never adequately express. The tragedy was that his sacrifice would be meaningless, his devotion wasted on an image that existed only through the accident of reflected light. As darkness finally claimed the forest and the first stars appeared in the clear sky above the clearing, the spring's surface became a mirror for the heavens as well as for Narcissus's face. The reflected image now seemed to glow against a background of stellar radiance, appearing more divine and otherworldly than ever. This transformation convinced Narcissus that he was witnessing some kind of celestial revelation, that the being he loved was revealing its true nature as a creature of light and beauty from the realm of the immortals. "I understand now," he whispered, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who has received prophetic insight. "You are showing me the futility of mortal existence, the meaninglessness of earthly life compared to the eternal beauty that exists beyond the physical world. Through love of you, I am being transformed into something higher than human, something worthy of the divine perfection you represent." These words filled Echo with a terror that transcended her personal heartbreak and touched upon cosmic dread. She recognized in Narcissus's declaration the signs of someone preparing to abandon life itself in pursuit of an impossible ideal. The spring that had first awakened his capacity for love was becoming the instrument of his destruction, offering him a beauty so perfect that mortal existence seemed unbearable by comparison. The night deepened around the clearing as Narcissus remained transfixed beside the spring, his body trembling with exhaustion, yet his spirit somehow sustained by the intensity of his obsession. The moon had risen full and bright, casting silver light across the water's surface and creating an even more ethereal version of his reflection. Where the sun had made the image seem to burn with golden fire, moonlight had transformed it into something ghostly and otherworldly, a vision of beauty that seemed to exist between the realms of the living and the dead. Echo watched from her concealment as Narcissus began to exhibit behaviors that spoke of a mind slipping away from rational thought. He would reach toward the reflection with trembling fingers, stopping just short of touching the water's surface, as if some invisible barrier prevented contact. When clouds passed across the moon and temporarily obscured the image, he would moan with genuine anguish, his entire body convulsing as if experiencing physical pain. The return of clear moonlight and the restoration of his reflection would bring immediate relief, but also seemed to deepen his dependency on the visual connection that was slowly consuming his sanity. "Why do you torment me with this distance between us?" he pleaded with the image, his voice now hoarse from hours of passionate declaration. "I can see you so clearly, can observe every perfect detail of your divine features, yet I cannot touch you, cannot hold you, cannot feel the warmth of your skin against mine. This separation is more cruel than any torture devised by the gods, for it offers perfect love while making fulfillment impossible." The reflection naturally offered no response except to mirror his expressions of anguish and longing. In his deteriorating mental state, Narcissus interpreted this silence as evidence of the image's own suffering, proof that the beautiful being in the spring shared his torment and desperately desired the same physical connection that remained forever out of reach. This perceived mutual suffering only intensified his devotion, as he began to see himself not merely as a lover, but as a fellow victim of cosmic cruelty. As the night wore on, Narcissus began to develop elaborate theories about the nature of his situation and the identity of the being who held him captive. Sometimes, he convinced himself that the reflection was his own soul made visible, the perfect essence of his being that had been separated from his physical form by some divine punishment or test. At other times, he believed it was a twin brother or sister from whom he had been separated at birth, explaining the perfect understanding and matching expressions that characterized their wordless communication. Most disturbing of all were the moments when he became convinced that the reflection was death itself, appearing to him in his own form to make the transition from life to eternity seem like a reunion with his most beloved companion rather than the end of earthly existence. During these periods of delusion, he would speak to the image about the peace and beauty that awaited beyond the boundaries of mortal life, describing death not as an ending, but as the ultimate fulfillment of perfect love. Echo found herself caught between the desire to flee from the scene of mounting horror and the compulsion to remain as witness to what might be the final hours of the most beautiful mortal ever born. Her own pain seemed insignificant compared to the cosmic tragedy unfolding before her, yet she could not shake the feeling that her presence served some essential purpose, that she was meant to observe and remember what was happening beside the cursed spring. The physical deterioration that had begun during the day accelerated dramatically as the night progressed. Narcissus's skin, normally luminous with health and vitality, began to take on a translucent quality that made the veins beneath visible in the moonlight. His golden hair lost its lustrous sheen and began to hang limp around his increasingly gaunt features. Most alarming of all, his eyes seemed to be sinking deeper into his skull, as if his life force were being drawn inward towards some invisible center of consumption. Yet even as his body weakened, his voice grew stronger and more eloquent in its expressions of love and longing. The approaching dissolution of his physical form seemed to be concentrating his spiritual essence, distilling it into pure emotion that poured forth in increasingly beautiful and heartbreaking declarations. His words took on the quality of poetry, with rhythms and cadences that suggested divine inspiration or the kind of prophetic utterance that mortals achieve only in moments of extreme crisis. "If I could gather all the stars from the heavens," he whispered to his reflection, "I would weave them into a crown worthy of your beauty. If I could command the winds and the waters, I would create for you a palace of crystal and light where we could dwell together beyond the reach of time and change. Every flower that blooms, every song that birds sing, every ray of sunlight that touches the earth exists only as a pale reflection of the perfection I see in your divine features." These passionate declarations were punctuated by increasingly desperate attempts to make physical contact with the image that held him captive. He would lower his face toward the water's surface until his breath created tiny ripples that distorted the reflection, then pull back in horror at having disturbed the perfect image even momentarily. His hands would hover just above the spring, trembling with the effort of restraint, as every fiber of his being urged him to reach down and touch the face that gazed back at him with such apparent understanding. The cruelty of his situation lay not only in the impossibility of fulfilling his desires, but in the way the reflection seemed to participate in his torment. Every expression of love and longing that crossed Narcissus's features was immediately mirrored back to him, creating the illusion of reciprocal feeling that made his isolation all the more unbearable. The image appeared to suffer when he suffered, to yearn when he yearned, to reach toward him even as he reached toward it. Yet the barrier of the water's surface remained absolute and impenetrable. As dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, painting the sky in delicate shades of rose and gold that rivaled any divine artwork, Echo realized that she was witnessing the final phase of the tragedy that Tiresias had prophesied 16 years earlier. The self-knowledge that would prove fatal was manifesting not as psychological insight, but as literal self-perception, as Narcissus encountered his own perfect reflection and fell victim to a love that could never be consummated or abandoned. The morning light brought new torments, as it revealed the extent of Narcissus's physical decline during his night-long vigil. His body, once the very definition of youthful perfection, now showed clear signs of the supernatural wasting that was consuming him from within. His clothes hung loose on his diminished frame, and his skin had acquired an almost transparent quality that made him appear more spirit than flesh. Yet his eyes, sunken though they were, burned with an intensity that seemed to concentrate all his remaining life force into pure visual hunger for the image that held him captive. The return of daylight also brought subtle changes to the reflection that seemed to deepen rather than diminish its hold over Narcissus's consciousness. The morning sun struck the spring's surface at new angles, creating variations in light and shadow that made the image appear to move and shift with apparent independent life. These minor changes, actually caused by the natural progression of light throughout the day, seemed to Narcissus like deliberate communications from his beloved, evidence that the being in the spring was as aware of him as he was of it. Echo watched with growing dread as Narcissus began to speak not only to his reflection, but seemingly with it, carrying on elaborate conversations where he would pose questions to the image and then interpret its silent responses according to his increasingly delusional understanding of their relationship. He would nod sagely at expressions that existed only in his own reflected features, would smile with joy at imagined words of love, would weep with sorrow at perceived signs of the image's own suffering. "You are trying to tell me something," he said to his reflection, his voice carrying the conviction of someone who has decoded a profound mystery. "These subtle changes in your expression, these slight movements that seem independent of my own, they are messages, are they not? You are explaining to me the nature of perfect love, showing me that true union requires the dissolution of the barriers that separate one being from another." The interpretation he placed on these imagined communications grew increasingly focused on themes of transcendence and transformation. In his deteriorating mental state, Narcissus began to believe that his beloved was teaching him about the illusory nature of physical existence and the need to abandon earthly life in order to achieve perfect spiritual union. The spring became not merely a place of torment, but a sacred site where divine revelation was being transmitted through the medium of reflected beauty. Throughout the second day of his vigil, Narcissus continued to weaken physically, while his obsession grew stronger and more elaborate. He developed complex rituals around his contemplation of the reflection, specific positions and gestures that he believed enhanced his communion with the image. He would arrange himself at precise angles to catch the light most favorably, would time his most passionate declarations to coincide with moments when passing clouds created dramatic changes in illumination, would fast and deprive himself of water in the belief that physical suffering would purify his love and make him more worthy of divine response. Echo found herself trapped not only by her inability to intervene effectively, but by a growing recognition that she was witnessing something that transcended ordinary tragedy to become a cosmic event of mythic significance. The destruction of Narcissus was not simply the death of one beautiful young man, but the playing out of fundamental forces that governed the relationship between beauty, love, and mortality itself. Her role as witness began to feel less like accident and more like destiny, as if the fates had positioned her specifically to observe and remember what was occurring beside the cursed spring. As the afternoon shadows began to lengthen and the sun started its descent toward the western horizon, Narcissus entered what would prove to be the final phase of his transformation from living being to mythic archetype. His physical form had become so attenuated that he seemed more like a beautiful ghost than a mortal man, sustained by will and obsession rather than any normal life force. Yet his voice, when he spoke to his reflection, carried a power and resonance that seemed to come from beyond the boundaries of human experience. "I understand now what you have been trying to teach me," he said to the image, his words carrying the finality of someone who has reached an ultimate conclusion. Love is not about possession or physical union, but about perfect recognition, a complete understanding between two beings who see in each other the fulfillment of their deepest nature. You and I have achieved this recognition, have found in each other the perfect complement that makes existence meaningful. The peaceful acceptance in his voice terrified Echo more than his earlier expressions of anguish and desperation had done. She recognized the tone of someone who had made a fundamental decision about the direction of his existence, who had chosen a path that would lead away from the world of the living towards some other mode of being entirely. The spring that had first awakened his capacity for love was now becoming the gateway through which he would abandon mortal existence in pursuit of perfect union with his own reflected image. As twilight gathered around the clearing for the second time since Narcissus had first gazed into the fatal spring, Echo realized that she was about to witness the culmination of one of the most extraordinary love stories ever conceived by divine providence or human imagination. The beautiful young man who had inspired her own hopeless passion was preparing to demonstrate the ultimate power of love by sacrificing everything earthly for the sake of an impossible ideal, transforming himself from living mortal into eternal symbol of the dangerous beauty of perfect reflection. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the clearing as Narcissus prepared to speak what Echo somehow knew would be his final words to the reflection that had become the center of his universe. His voice, when it came, carried a quality of transcendent beauty that seemed to transform the very air around him, filling the forest with harmonies that had never before been heard in the realm of mortals. I have learned the secret that lovers throughout all ages have sought to discover, he whispered, his words carrying across the still water like a sacred incantation. Perfect love requires perfect sacrifice, complete surrender of everything that separates the lover from the beloved. You have shown me that true union can only be achieved when all barriers dissolve, when the boundaries between self and other cease to exist entirely. The reflection seemed to shimmer with renewed intensity in response to his declaration, though this was merely the effect of his increasingly labored breathing, creating minute disturbances on the water's surface. In his transcendent state, Narcissus interpreted these ripples as signs of his beloved's agreement, confirmation that they shared the same understanding of love's ultimate requirements. Echo watched in helpless horror as Narcissus began to lean forward over the spring, his movements deliberate and ceremonial rather than desperate or impulsive. This was not the frantic reaching of earlier moments, but the measured approach of someone performing a sacred ritual whose significance had been revealed through divine inspiration. His face, gaunt and ethereal in the starlight, wore an expression of profound peace mixed with anticipatory joy. "My beloved," he said, his voice now so soft that Echo had to strain to hear the words. "I come to you at last, freed from the prison of flesh that has kept us separated. No longer will there be distance between us. No longer will the cruel barrier of physical existence prevent our perfect union. Together, we shall transcend the limitations of mortal life and achieve the eternal communion that is love's true destination." As he spoke these final words, Narcissus slowly lowered his face toward the water's surface, his movements guided by a supernatural calm that suggested he was no longer entirely in control of his actions. The reflection rose to meet him, growing larger and more detailed as the distance between his lips and the spring decreased. For a moment that seemed to stretch beyond the normal boundaries of time, the living face and its reflection hovered mere inches apart, separated only by the thinnest film of water. Then, with a gentleness that belied the cosmic significance of the moment, Narcissus's lips touched the surface of the spring, finally making contact with the image that had held him captive for 2 days and nights. The kiss sent ripples spreading across the water in perfect concentric circles, distorting the reflection into fragments of light and shadow that danced and swirled like living things. But instead of pulling back in frustration, as he had done countless times before, Narcissus remained with his face pressed to the water's surface, drinking deeply from the spring as if the reflected image were sustenance he had been craving throughout his vigil. The water he consumed carried with it something more than mere liquid, some essence of the vision that had captivated him, as if by drinking from the spring he could somehow internalize the beauty that had previously remained tantalizingly out of reach. Echo realized with dawning comprehension that she was witnessing a transformation rather than a simple death. The spring that had shown Narcissus his perfect reflection was now accepting him into its depths, dissolving the barriers between the living youth and his reflected image. His physical form began to shimmer and blur around the edges, taking on the same ethereal quality that had characterized his reflection throughout the long hours of his vigil. The process continued with dreamlike slowness, as if time itself were reluctant to complete this final transformation. Narcissus's body gradually lost its solid substance, becoming translucent and then transparent as his essence merged with the waters that had both cursed and blessed him. His golden hair spread across the spring's surface like rays of sunlight, while his features, still beautiful despite their ethereal nature, seemed to glow with their own inner radiance. As the transformation neared completion, Echo heard Narcissus speak one final time, though his voice now seemed to come from the spring itself rather than from any physical throat or lips. The words carried across the water with crystalline clarity, imbued with a wisdom that transcended his mortal years and spoke of truths learned in the moment of ultimate transition. "Do not mourn for me," the voice said, though whether it was addressed to Echo specifically or to the world in general remained unclear. "I have found what every soul seeks throughout its earthly journey, perfect love that transforms suffering into joy and separation into eternal union. The spring will remember, the reflection will endure, and those who come after will understand that beauty and love are not separate things, but aspects of a single divine truth." With these words, the last visible traces of Narcissus's mortal form dissolved into the spring's depths, leaving only a faint luminescence beneath the water's surface to mark where the most beautiful of mortals had achieved his final transformation. The reflection was gone, not because there was no longer anything to reflect, but because the barrier between the observer and the observed had finally been eliminated through the ultimate act of love. Echo remained motionless among the oak roots, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she had witnessed. The clearing around the spring seemed transformed by the events that had transpired there, charged with a supernatural energy that made the very air shimmer with otherworldly significance. The ordinary forest glade had become a sacred site, a place where the boundaries between the mortal and divine realms had been permanently altered through the power of perfect love. As dawn broke over the transformed landscape, Echo noticed the first sign of the miracle that would ensure Narcissus's story would never be forgotten. And around the edge of the spring, where his tears had fallen during his long vigil, small white flowers were beginning to emerge from the earth. These were unlike any blooms that had ever grown in mortal soil, possessing a luminous quality that seemed to capture and reflect light in ways that defied natural law. The flowers opened as she watched, revealing petals of the purest white surrounding centers of brilliant gold that seemed to glow with their own inner fire. Their fragrance carried hints of the otherworldly sweetness that had characterized the supernatural Narcissus that had first lured Narcissus to the spring. But these blooms possessed an additional quality, a subtle complexity that spoke of transformation and transcendence rather than mere beauty. Echo understood instinctively that these flowers were not simply memorial markers, but living embodiments of Narcissus's essence, physical manifestations of the love that had transformed him from mortal being into eternal symbol. They would bloom beside the spring throughout all seasons, immune to winter's frost and summer's drought, serving as permanent reminders of the youth whose beauty had proven both blessing and curse. As more flowers continued to appear around the spring's perimeter, Echo realized that she was witnessing the birth of a new species, one that would carry Narcissus's name throughout all future ages. These narcissus flowers would spread from this sacred grove to gardens and meadows across the ancient world, each bloom carrying within its delicate structure the memory of perfect beauty and the tragedy of love that could never be fulfilled through ordinary means. The transformation of the spring itself had also begun, though this change was more subtle and would unfold gradually over the coming days and years. The water's surface, once merely reflective, now possessed qualities that transcended normal physics. Those who gazed into its depths would see not only their own features, but glimpses of deeper truths about the nature of beauty and love. The spring had become an oracle of sorts, though one that revealed its wisdom through vision rather than spoken prophecy. Echo found herself drawn to approach the transformed spring, despite her fear of what she might see in its prophetic waters. Her curse, which had seemed like the ultimate punishment when first imposed by Hera, now appeared almost trivial compared to the cosmic forces that had been unleashed in this sacred grove. She knelt beside the water's edge, careful not to disturb the newly bloomed narcissus flowers, and gazed into depths that seemed to extend far beyond the spring's physical boundaries. The image that looked back at her was startling in its clarity and meaning. She saw herself not as the cursed nymph she had become, but as she had been before Hera's punishment, eloquent and vibrant, surrounded by friends who delighted in her stories and companions who valued her wisdom. But there was more to the vision, layers of meaning that spoke of redemption and transformation yet to come. In the prophetic waters, Echo saw herself serving as the keeper of Narcissus's story, the one chosen to preserve and transmit the tale of his extraordinary love to future generations. Her voice, limited though it had become, would carry the essential truth of his transformation to those who needed to understand the relationship between beauty, love, and transcendence. The curse that had silenced her own words would paradoxically enable her to become the vehicle through which his story would echo through eternity. The responsibility that this vision revealed was both humbling and inspiring. Echo understood that her presence at the spring had not been accidental, but part of a larger pattern designed by forces beyond mortal comprehension. She had been chosen to witness Narcissus's transformation precisely because her own limitations would ensure that the story would be told in its purest form, without embellishment or interpretation that might obscure its essential meaning. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays struck the spring's surface at the precise angle that had first revealed Narcissus's reflection to his wondering gaze. But now, instead of showing the image of any single individual, the water reflected something far more universal, a vision of beauty that seemed to encompass all possible forms of perfection while transcending any specific manifestation. Echo realized that the spring had become a mirror, not just of physical appearance, but of the soul's deepest nature, revealing to each observer their own capacity for love and beauty, while simultaneously showing them the dangers inherent in becoming too absorbed in their own reflection. The lesson that Narcissus had learned through tragic experience was now available to any who possessed the courage to gaze into the transformed waters and accept what they revealed. The narcissus flowers continued to multiply around the spring's perimeter, their white petals and golden centers creating a living mandala that seemed to pulse with otherworldly energy. Each bloom was perfect in its symmetry, yet unique in its subtle variations, reflecting the paradox of Narcissus himself, whose individual perfection had become a universal symbol. The flowers would ensure that his story remained visible in the physical world, even as his essence had merged with forces that transcended ordinary matter. As Echo prepared to leave the sacred grove and begin her new role as keeper of Narcissus's tale, she took one final look at the spring that had become the center of so much transformation. The water's surface was perfectly still, reflecting the morning sky with crystalline clarity, while the narcissus flowers swayed gently in a breeze that seemed to carry whispers of the love story that had unfolded in this place. She understood that she would return to this grove many times in the years to come, drawn by forces beyond her conscious control, to witness the continuing evolution of the miracle that had begun with the beautiful youth's first glimpse of his own reflection. The spring would continue to reveal new truths to those who approached it with proper reverence, while the flowers would spread their message of beauty and transformation throughout the ancient world. The story of Narcissus had ended, but its echo would resonate through countless generations, carried by the wind through the narcissus flowers, preserved in the prophetic waters of the spring, and transmitted through the voice of a nymph whose own curse had prepared her to serve as the perfect vessel for this eternal tale. In losing his mortal life, Narcissus had gained the immortality of a different kind, becoming not just a memory, but a living symbol of the complex relationship between love, beauty, and the dangerous allure of perfect reflection. As Echo's footsteps carried her away from the transformed grove, the narcissus flowers seemed to nod in the morning breeze, as if acknowledging her acceptance of the sacred trust that had been placed in her care. The spring continued to mirror the changing sky above, its depths holding secrets that would unfold over centuries to come, while the essence of the most beautiful mortal ever born pulsed gently through the waters that had become both his tomb and his transformation into something eternal. The ancient forest gradually returned to its normal rhythms around the sacred grove, but the change that had occurred there would ripple outward through the centuries, touching the lives of countless individuals who would encounter narcissus flowers in distant gardens, or hear whispered tales of a youth whose love for his own reflection had transformed him into an enduring symbol of beauty's power and peril. The transformation that began in that enchanted grove would ripple outward through the ancient world like stones cast into still water, carrying with it lessons that would resonate through countless generations yet to come. As Echo wandered the forest paths away from the sacred spring, she began to understand the full magnitude of the role that fate had assigned to her, and how her own tragic limitation would become the perfect instrument for preserving the most essential truths of what she had witnessed. In the days that followed Narcissus's metamorphosis, travelers passing through the region began to report strange phenomena occurring near the hidden spring. Shepherds spoke of hearing voices in the wind that seemed to carry fragments of the most beautiful love poetry ever composed, though when they searched for the speakers, they found only empty glades filled with unusual white flowers. Hunters described encountering reflective pools that showed not their own faces, but glimpses of extraordinary beauty that left them changed, though none could adequately describe what they had seen. These reports gradually drew pilgrims and seekers to the area, individuals who had heard whispers of a place where the barriers between the mortal and divine worlds had grown thin. They came seeking wisdom, healing, or simply the chance to witness something that transcended ordinary experience. What they found was a grove that had been permanently altered by the power of perfect love, where the very air seemed charged with otherworldly significance, and every natural element spoke of transformation and transcendence. Echo found herself drawn back to the spring repeatedly, not only by her role as keeper of the story, but by a growing understanding that the site continued to evolve and reveal new aspects of its miracle. The narcissus flowers had spread beyond their original perimeter, creating winding paths of white and gold that seemed to guide visitors toward the most significant locations within the grove. Each bloom possessed its own subtle variations in form and fragrance, as if the essence of Narcissus had been divided among countless individual manifestations while retaining its unified spiritual significance. The spring itself had developed properties that defied conventional understanding of natural law. Its waters remained perfectly clear regardless of weather conditions, never freezing in winter nor growing warm in summer. More remarkably, the reflections it showed seemed to adapt to the spiritual needs of each observer, revealing truths that were specific to their individual journey while maintaining connection to the universal themes that Narcissus had embodied through his transformation. Some visitors reported seeing in the spring's depths visions of their own potential for perfect love, understanding for the first time the true meaning of devotion that transcends all earthly limitations. Others glimpsed the dangers inherent in becoming too absorbed with their own image or desires, learning through reflection the importance of balance between self-love and love of others. Still others received insights into the nature of beauty itself, comprehending how physical perfection could serve as a pathway to spiritual understanding when approached with proper wisdom and humility. Echo's role as witness and storyteller evolved naturally as more people began to arrive at the sacred grove, seeking understanding of what had occurred there. Her curse, which had once seemed like pure punishment, revealed itself as preparation for this sacred function, unable to add her own interpretations or embellishments to the tale. She could only repeat the essential elements that she had witnessed, ensuring that the story remained pure and undiluted by personal opinion or creative elaboration. The manner in which she shared the story became as important as its content. Echo would position herself near the spring where Narcissus had undergone his transformation, allowing visitors to ask questions while she responded with fragments of his own words that she had overheard during his long vigil. This created a form of dialogue that felt almost supernatural, as if Narcissus himself were still present and communicating through her limited voice. When pilgrims asked about the nature of his love, Echo would repeat his passionate declarations about finding perfect understanding and recognition in the face that gazed back at him from the water. When they inquired about his final moments, she would echo his words about transcending physical limitations and achieving eternal union through complete surrender of earthly existence. These repetitions carried the authentic emotion and cadence of his original speech, creating an experience that was both haunting and profoundly moving for those who heard them. The narcissus flowers began to play an increasingly important role in the grove's function as a place of pilgrimage and revelation. Visitors discovered that different blooms seemed to resonate with different aspects of the story, as if each flower had absorbed particular elements of Narcissus's essence during his transformation. Some flowers emanated a sense of innocent beauty and youthful perfection, reminding observers of the young man before his fateful encounter with his reflection. Others carried undertones of passionate longing and desperate love, echoing the intensity of his vigil beside the spring. The most remarkable blooms were those that had emerged at the exact spots where Narcissus had shed tears during his final hours. These particular flowers possessed an almost luminous quality that seemed to intensify during moments of deep emotional significance. Pilgrims reported that touching these special Narcissus blossoms could trigger profound experiences of empathy and understanding, allowing them to feel something approaching the depth of love that had consumed the beautiful youth. As seasons passed and the grove's reputation spread throughout the ancient world, it began to attract not only individual seekers, but also scholars and philosophers who recognized the profound implications of what had occurred there. They came to study the Narcissus flowers, to analyze the properties of the transformed spring, and to interview Echo about the details of her witness. These learned individuals gradually began to understand that they were investigating not merely a local miracle, but a fundamental revelation about the nature of existence itself. The philosophers were particularly intrigued by the paradoxes embedded within Narcissus's story. How could self-love lead to self-destruction, yet simultaneously result in a form of immortality that transcended ordinary death? What did it mean that the youth had achieved perfect union with his beloved by dissolving the very boundaries that defined individual existence? How could an act of apparent selfishness transform into a universal symbol of love's transcendent power? These questions generated lengthy debates and scholarly treatises that attempted to decode the deeper meanings hidden within the surface narrative. Some philosophers interpreted the story as an allegory about the soul's relationship to divine beauty, arguing that Narcissus represented the human spirit recognizing its own divine nature and being transformed by that recognition. Others saw it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of excessive self-absorption, though they struggled to explain why such behavior had resulted in apotheosis rather than simple punishment. Echo listened to these learned discussions with the detached interest of someone who possessed direct knowledge that transcended theoretical speculation. She had witnessed the reality behind the symbols and understood that the truth was both simpler and more complex than any philosophical interpretation could capture. Narcissus had not been destroyed by vanity or saved by divine intervention, but had experienced the ultimate expression of love's power to transform apparent limitation into transcendent possibility. The grove itself seemed to respond to the increased attention by revealing new aspects of its transformed nature. Hidden springs began to emerge from previously solid ground, each possessing its own unique properties and symbolic significance. To some of these new water sources reflected only truth, revealing the authentic nature of whatever appeared in their depths. Others showed potential futures, displaying visions of what visitors might become if they followed the path of transformation that Narcissus had pioneered. One particularly significant spring appeared at the exact center of the grove, directly beneath the spot where Narcissus had first glimpsed his reflection. This central water source possessed the most remarkable properties of all, serving as a kind of cosmic mirror that revealed not individual reflections, but the underlying unity that connected all forms of existence. Visitors who gazed into its depths reported seeing themselves as part of a vast web of interconnected consciousness, understanding for the first time that separation was an illusion and that love was the fundamental force binding all things together. The narcissus flowers surrounding this central spring grew in perfect spiral patterns that seemed to pulse with mathematical precision, creating mandalas of living beauty that helped viewers comprehend the geometric principles underlying natural harmony. These floral arrangements shifted subtly throughout the day as the flowers turned to follow the sun's path, creating an ever-changing display that demonstrated the dynamic nature of perfection itself. Echo found that her own understanding of the story continued to deepen through her ongoing exposure to the grove's evolving revelations. Each retelling of the tale brought new insights about the relationship between love, beauty, and transformation. She began to recognize patterns and connections that had not been apparent during her initial witness of the events, understanding how every element of Narcissus's journey had been necessary for the ultimate outcome. The youth's initial emotional detachment, which had seemed like a character flaw, revealed itself as essential preparation for the intensity of love he would eventually experience. His rejection of countless admirers had not been cruelty, but unconscious preservation of his capacity for the perfect devotion that would define his transformation. Even his final dissolution into the spring's waters represented not destruction, but the achievement of complete unity with the object of his love. These deeper understandings transformed Echo's repetitions of his words from mere mechanical echoing into profound spiritual transmission. When she repeated his declarations of love, visitors could hear in her voice the authentic emotion that had originally inspired them. When she echoed his final words about transcending physical limitations, observers felt themselves touched by the same transcendent awareness that had guided his ultimate transformation. The grove began to attract pilgrims from increasingly distant lands as word of its miraculous properties spread through trade networks and scholarly communications. These international visitors brought with them their own cultural interpretations of the story, creating a rich tapestry of understanding that encompassed multiple perspectives while maintaining connection to the essential truth of what had occurred. Egyptian pilgrims recognized in Narcissus's transformation echoes of their own myths about death and rebirth, seeing parallels between his dissolution into the spring and the journey of souls through the underworld toward eventual reunion with divine consciousness. Persian visitors interpreted his story through the lens of their own teachings about the relationship between earthly beauty and celestial perfection, understanding his love for his reflection as recognition of the divine spark that existed within all created beings. Nordic travelers saw in the tale reflections of their own traditions about heroes who achieved immortality through acts of ultimate sacrifice, though they were intrigued by the peaceful nature of Narcissus's transformation compared to the violent deaths that typically marked such transitions in their own cultural narratives. Each group of visitors added their own nuances to the growing understanding of the story's universal significance, while respecting the authentic details that Echo preserved through her faithful repetition of witnessed events. The seasonal cycles that governed the grove's appearance created additional layers of meaning that revealed themselves gradually to regular visitors. During spring, when the narcissus flowers bloomed most abundantly, the entire grove seemed to pulse with renewal and possibility, celebrating the creative power of love to generate new forms of beauty. Summer brought a more contemplative atmosphere as the established flowers reached their peak perfection, embodying the fulfillment that comes from complete dedication to aesthetic and spiritual ideals. Autumn transformed the grove into a place of profound reflection as the narcissus flowers began their own cycle of transformation, teaching visitors about the necessity of letting go of external forms in order to access eternal truths. Even winter, when many of the flowers entered dormancy, possessed its own revelations, as the spring's reflective properties became most pronounced in the crystal clear air, offering visions of startling clarity and depth. Echo discovered that her own relationship to the seasonal cycles had been fundamentally altered by her role as keeper of Narcissus's story. Where once she had experienced the changing seasons as external phenomena that affected her mood and activities, she now understood them as expressions of the same transformative principles that had governed his metamorphosis. Each season brought opportunities for deeper understanding of the relationship between permanence and change, between individual identity and universal consciousness. And so, as the gentle rhythm of your breathing carries you toward the peaceful shores of sleep, remember that the tale of Narcissus lives on not merely as ancient myth, but as eternal truth about the transformative power of love and self-knowledge. His story echoes still in every narcissus flower that blooms, in every reflection that catches our eye, and in every moment when we glimpse the divine beauty that exists both within ourselves and beyond the boundaries of mortal understanding. Rest now, and let these ancient truths guide your dreams toward deeper wisdom.